Thank you very much, Dave. After that kind introduction, I'd ask you all to lower your expectations. Always have to do this. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Camille. I know few Jesuits, including myself, who could be so crisp and clear. If somebody said, quick, tell the story of Ignatian, I couldn't have done it, so thank you. Congratulations again, even though you guys beat my Dodgers. Do you know that Mark Twain was alive the last time the Cubs won? Just wrap your mind around that. It's a privilege. I have so much respect for Bill Creed and for ISP and for what you do. So it's a privilege to be with all of you. And it's the privilege of my life for 30 years to have come to know thousands of gang members who have walked through our doors at Homeboy Industries, who have worked there and have found healing there. People like Luis Perez, who runs the place along with the core group of gang members who now are in charge, which is nice. And so it affords me to be here. And Luis is he's in charge of personnel development. And a gang member, shot caller, heroin addict, was in prison for a long time. And now he kind of runs the show. And he was also, he's a pretty good public speaker. And so we went out to dinner not long ago, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. He said, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. That's some good advice there. So brace yourselves. Kind of the common vision that joins us together is certainly Ignatian, and it's certainly somehow wanting to be in the world who our God is, compassionate and loving and kind. But we want to kind of imagine something different. We want to imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And to that end, we want to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And so, especially nowadays, feeling and hearing this invitation from Pope Francis to stand at the margins, the thing about the margins, if you stand there, you look under your feet, they're getting erased, the margins, because you chose to stand there. And you stand with a kind of particularity with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. You stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Every once in a while, you get this extraordinary privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized, so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And so in our imagining with God, we try to imagine a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it, understanding, as Mother Teresa tells us, that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. It's what Dave just said about being connected and being dedicated to that connection. And we want to bridge any kind of distance that there might be, because this is God's dream come true. It's important then to kind of identify, especially like in Ignatian terms, the God who is always greater. And my spiritual director once said to me, we need a better God than the one we have. And I think that's true, actually, because sometimes our own sense of God can atrophy, can grow tiny if we're not careful. And then suddenly we've invented a created God in our own image rather than the other way around. Anne Lamott always says, you've created God in your own image when God hates all the same people you do. So we're human beings. We can't help ourselves, but we can catch ourselves. And so we want to try to find this expansive, spacious God so that we can inhabit that place in the world where we can choose to be the God we have. At Homeboy Industries, the homies are always kind of mangling the English language in the same charming and illuminating way that Yogi Berra used to do, And once I was in my office not long ago, and a homegirl named Lisa, who's a trainee there, and she was wanted to introduce her man to me, who had come at the end of the day to pick her up. And she said, "This is my sufficient other." I said, "No doubt." Because I have a CEO now who kind of runs our $18 million annual operation, I don't have to worry about budgets so much, or cash flow, or all that kind of stuff. And with 7 social enterprises, it's a hard thing to keep tabs on. So I'm happy to have him in charge, and that just happened a short time ago. And I had a homie in my office, and he said, "Damn, gee, my lady, she is in a bad mood." And I said, "Why?" "Well, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I've just ended mine, so kind of know what she's going through." But I told you all that to tell you this. Once I was presiding at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, a big cavernous gym with about 500 gang members in it, for Sunday liturgy, and I was vested sitting on a folding chair. And they have these little hojas, these little sheets that have English and Spanish, the readings in them, and I have them the little sheet resting on my lap. So you know how you do this when you preside, maybe you close your eyes, and I'm going to listen to the word proclaimed rather than, follow along. And so a homie got up, and I think it was Psalm 138, and with kind of an overabundance of confidence, he got up and he said, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And it said, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. That is a better God than the one we have. That is, as Ignatius would say, the God who's always greater. The God who shows us how to extend ourselves for the other, to lose ourselves in somehow wanting this dream to come true where we are connected with each other. Even in service, it's so ubiquitous now in all our schools with our kids. Everybody does service, and obviously, who can be against it, except that it can't be where we end up. It has to be where you begin. The notion that Jesus really was one with others rather than just a man for others. That service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, the place of exquisite mutuality, where there is no us and them, where there's just us. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and I can remember once he was one of the best listeners I've ever, if you were having a conversation with him, nobody else existed. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important was on the approach. But once, quite famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual." And that is, of course, what you want. You want this kind of exquisite mutuality. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. I mean, the truth be told, we're all a cry for help. We're all in need of healing. It's one of the things that joins us together as members of the human family. And that's the hope, that somehow we'll bridge that distance. There was a homie named Dreamer. We all called him Dreamer, and nobody found more job opportunities through Homeboy Industries than this guy. And I knew him since he was a little mocosito growing up in the housing projects when I was pastor there. He got into a gang. Very smart kid with a great sense of humor, a kind of a dangerous sense of humor, which I always enjoyed. He's in his 40s now and doing well. But in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo, kind of in and out of being locked up. And I'd find him a job here or a job there in one of our businesses or in the private sector, but he'd always sort of gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of. And then he'd wander back to Homeboy again. So this was a pattern that kept repeating itself. So this one time he had finished a 4-month stretch of probation violation at county jail, and there he is sitting in front of my desk, and he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." And I go, okay. So with him sitting there, I call a friend of mine named Gary, who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. And Gary had hired homies in the past, so I'm thinking maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, he says, "Yeah, you tell him he can start tomorrow." That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer began work the next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again, sitting in front of my desk, and I go, "Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go all over again." But this time he pulls out of his pocket his very first paycheck, and he waves it proudly, and he says, "Damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me. My kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, who?" And he looked at me strangely and he said, "Well, God, of course." And, "Oh, sure, no." That's right, that would be God. "You thought I was going to say you." I said, "No, gosh. God's number one." And he said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now." And all I remember was that we just fell out of our chairs and we died laughing. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider and who's the service recipient. It's mutual. So all of us are called in our way to stand at the margins, and called as we stand there to be what Alice Miller, the late great child psychologist, called enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking people to measure up, because our God doesn't do that ever. Our God is always wondering, what's all the measuring about? So instead, we just try to hold the mirror up and tell people the truth, knowing that your truth is my truth, and my truth is a gang member's truth, and it's all the same truth, and here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks on the margins as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth, and no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. Last week I buried my 216th young person killed in our streets for no reason whatsoever. He was a young man who worked for us a long time ago. And before he left us, he knew the truth of who he was. And for all the loss and the grief of this moment, what is death compared to knowing that truth? But part of the task, certainly at the margins, is to reach in occasionally and have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. For indeed, the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout Scripture is shame and disgrace. I think if you look in the Acts of the Apostles, quite beyond a quaint snapshot of life in the earliest Christian community, you'll kind of see all these things that really become the measure of health in any community. Things like see how they love one another, or there's nobody needy in this community. That's a pretty good metric. My favorite one of all is the one that says simply, and awe came upon everyone. It would seem that the measure of our health in our communities anywhere may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. You know, my church, I guess, is now, though I say Mass occasionally at Dolores Mission, but I'm mainly at all these detention facilities where I say Mass on a rotating basis and on Saturdays and Sundays. And so it's always kind of the same. You know, I have a couple Masses way out in the middle of nowhere where they have these detention facilities for juveniles. And then I race back to Dolores Mission because I've been there for 30 years, so I get asked to do stuff. So it's like 1 o'clock baptism, 2 o'clock quinceañera, where a girl turns 15, 3 o'clock wedding, 4 o'clock exorcism. Just checking to see if you're still listening to me. Actually never done one of those. So I raced home one day and it was 12:30 and I thought, well, maybe I'll go to my office and I can kind of open the mail by myself. You know, and there I was, contento, feliz, solito, all alone, opening the mail. And it's about 20 minutes to 1 in my baptism, and a woman walks in, and I find out later her name is Lisa, and she's like in her mid-30s. And this is the first time she's ever stepped foot in Homeboy Industries' office. She's kind of well known on the street. She's a homeless person. She's a prostitute. She's a heroin addict. She's a gang member, tattooed, and a felon. The homies always call her La Gritona because she's always screaming. You can hear her scream next door at the bar as she's being tossed out, and she's yelling at the owner. Or you can hear her in a payphone screaming, "Just let me stay tonight," pleading with family members and friends. And this is the first time she's ever stepped foot in my office. And now it's 15 minutes to 1 in my baptism. And she comes in and she plunks herself down and she launches right in. She says, "I need help." Oh, I've been to like 50 rehabs. I'm known all over, nationwide. Went to Catholic schools all my life, she says. Graduated from elementary. I even graduated from Sacred Heart High School in Lincoln Heights. And then she gets quiet. In fact, the first time I ever used heroin was the day after I graduated from high school. And I've been trying to stop since the moment I began. And I watched as she leaned her head against the wall behind her, and her eyes became like two ponds, water rising to meet its edges and spilling over. And she cried until she leveled her gaze at me, and she said with great deliberation, "I am a disgrace." And suddenly her shame meets mine, because when I had seen her step into my office that afternoon, I had mistaken her for an interruption. Some time ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And I said yes, but I don't think I had read not so fine print so well. It was a one-day conference, a 9 to 5 gang-in service. I figure I'm going to do the keynote or something, and lunchtime, or open it or close it, and I pull out the letter just before I'm about to leave, and I couldn't believe it. It's a gang-in service from 9 to 5. I am to be the only speaker at this thing. And I thought, oh my God. So I invite 2 trainees in, Andre and Jose, and I sit them down, and I said, look, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I never heard their stories, and Jose gets up, and he's about 25 years old at the time, and he's one of our trainees. So we have an 18-month training program, and it has different phases. And he ended up his last phase as a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man very solid in his own recovery, and now he was helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. Gang member, tattooed, been to prison, but he also had a long stretch of time as a homeless man, and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And so he gets up and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. He said, and we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. He said, I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the man comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day with things you could imagine in my elementary school years, and a lot of things you couldn't imagine. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see the blood. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking. He was so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could speak, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For if the truth be told, if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. The original covenantal relationship with God says, as I have loved you, so must you have a special love for the widow and the orphan and the stranger. And God identifies these three subgroupings of the poor because God thinks these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they've suffered this particular pain, God thinks they're trustworthy to guide the rest of us to kinship and exquisite mutuality. ISP is a praise that God has interest in because it values the trustworthy guides, because it stands with them, doesn't try to reach them. It allows oneself to be reached by them, which is the great gift, of course. Let me just end with this last story. It occurs to people, universities sometimes, to force their students to read my book against their will. I'm not complaining. But the freshman class at my alma mater, Gonzaga University, was forced to read Tattoos on the Heart, so they invited me, and they said, bring 2 homies with you. And I always pick homies to come with me with the same kind of criteria. I always pick enemies, rivals, who work together at Homeboy, just so that they share a hotel room just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing them panicked in the sky. I'm going to D.C. Later next week, and 2 older vatos who've never been on a plane, and one of them says to me, are we flying Virgin because it's our first time? I said, why, yes, as a matter of fact. So I picked 2 guys, Bobby, African-American gang member who worked in the bakery, and then Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store. And I've done this hundreds and thousands of times with men and women, but I've never picked anybody who was more terrified of flying than this guy Mario. I mean, he was hyperventilating, and we hadn't even boarded the plane yet, and so we were flying out of Burbank, and it's a tiny little airport, and it's big bay windows, Southwest Airlines, and the feature there is they don't have that hermetically sealed chute you have to get on the plane. You have to walk out into the tarmac. They're big planes. So they have stairs that go to the front of the plane and the back of the plane, which is the big feature there. And so I watch our plane get in, and the one we're going to get on, and Mario's sitting next to him, and I said, there's our plane, and I go, oh my God, he may die before we climb up those stairs, and then I see 2 flight attendants, females, with very large cups each of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps of the plane, and Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. So I should tell you that Mario is like the most tattooed individual who's ever worked at Homeboy, which is really saying a lot. He's all sleeved out, and his neck is blackened with the name of his gang, and his head is shaved and covered with tattoos, and his forehead and cheeks and chin, all but a little tiny area. And I'd never been in public with him, and so we were walking through Burbank Airport, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I think, wow, that's interesting, because if you were to go to Homeboy Industries and ask anybody there, who's the kindest, most gentle, tender soul who works here, they wouldn't say me. They'd say Mario. He's so effusive in his kindness and his tenderness as the air he breathes. And even for as terrified as he was on the plane, the flight attendant handed him peanuts, and he didn't just take them, and he didn't just thank her. He grabbed her hand and looked her in the eye. And, thank you so much. It was just really over the top. So we get to Gonzaga, and of course, as happens a lot of times at universities, they'll have the main talk Tuesday night, which was a huge venue, like 2,000 people. And what they don't tell you is that they've planned 93 other talks for you, like this class, this meeting, this lunch, this class, all day long. So I tell these two guys, I'm not going to speak at any of them. I'm going to have them, I'll be in the back of the classroom, but I want them to get up and tell their stories. And they did, and Mario in particular was a little nervous, but their stories were just stories of torture and terror and violence and abuse of every kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. So the nighttime venue comes and it's packed, and I tell the two of them, I want you both to get up and do a little 5-minute so that I can include you in the question and answer at the end. And they were nervous, especially Mario, but they did a good job. And then we finish, and I call them up, and they're standing on either side of me. Yes, yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out of the gate is for Mario. And Mario comes up to the microphone. He's this tall drink of water, and yes, and he's terrified. And well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter who are about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes, and he's just trembling. I can feel the rising emotion, and he's getting a damn hernia trying to come up with an answer to this. And finally he blurts out, and as soon as he says those two words, he retreats back to his closed-eyed retreat, and he's trembling all the more, and I can feel that he's losing the battle with his emotions, but he wants to get this sentence out. When finally he says to her, I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question, it's her turn to cry, and she stands and she looks at him and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 2,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself, and everyone in the room also returned to themselves. Exquisitely mutual. And I think that's the only praise God has any interest in. So we stand at the margins, and the margins get erased, and the circle of compassion widens so that nobody is standing outside of it. And pretty soon we're beyond caring if anyone accuses us of wasting our time. For the prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Congratulations to ISP for making those voices heard. Thank you very much.